Well, teen pot use is up in our state. A recent study found higher use rates amongst 8th and 10th graders since Washington legalized marijuana. So what does that mean for you and your family? Dr. Elizabeth Mead from Swedish Medical Center joining us once again to explain. Good morning.
Hi.
Well, obviously, teen pot use is illegal, but why else is this bad for teens?
Well, so we know that when people start using marijuana in their teenage years, that it can have very different and much more negative effects than if they start using it as adults.
Well, the study also found the number of teens who perceived marijuana as harmful decreased. Is that a problem, too?
That's a big problem, I think, because, when we look at kids, we've been sort of waiting for this data since we legalized marijuana recreationally for adults in our state. Just to be clear, it's still not legal for kids.
Right.
But I think when they look at these numbers, about 2%, the number of 8th graders who have used marijuana went up by about 2%, and the number of 10th graders that use marijuana went up by about 4%. But the number of kids in both of those age groups that felt that it wasn't harmful went up by about 15%.
Wow.
So that's a big jump.
That's a big jump.
Yeah.
What are some of the negative effects of marijuana? Especially for what the study said, 8th and 10th graders.
Yep.
I mean, what are the differences there?
Yeah, so the earlier that kids start using it, the more negative effects it can have. So when we look at people who start in adulthood, we think we haven't found a significant number of negative things. But in childhood and adolescence, you can have a drop in your IQ by about 8 points, which is not insignificant. And we don't think that you probably gain those points back. There's an increased risk of schizophrenia and other mental health disorders. So this is really concerning for people as well. And then it can increase depression, anxiety, and kids can really have a hard time in school. They can become kind of unmotivated and have a hard time finishing. And in that critical kind of period of brain development that is the teenage years, this is why we think it's so much more negative effects than in adulthood.
Wow. As a parent of 3, my kids are still young, but they're going to become teenagers eventually. So what are some of the warning signs that I need to look out for, other parents need to look out for?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, talking to your kids early and often is really good. We say this over and over again, but it is never too young to start telling your kids about this because they're going to learn about it from their peers much younger than you think.
Yeah.
And so if they have that foundation of being able to discuss it with parents, it's great. But if you notice that your child is having significant behavior changes, so they're sleeping a lot more or a lot less, they're eating a lot more or a lot less, they're gaining or losing weight, their grades are falling in school, they stop being interested in activities, those are just signs that something is going on. Now, drug use can be one of those things. It can also be lots of other problems. But those are times when parents need to say, we have to talk and figure out what's going on here.
Yeah, and then once you get to that point, how do you even strike this conversation? I mean, do you just straight out say, I think you're using marijuana, or do you go around it? I mean, what's the best way?
So it's good to be frank and open with your kids. I think accusatory conversation is never a good place to start. And this is one reason why it's so helpful to start talking about it early. Because if you've never talked to your kids about pot and all of a sudden when they're a senior in high school, you're like, we need to talk about it, they're going to feel like you think I'm doing something, right? So, but I think a good place to start if you think your child is doing drugs is to just say, I know that lots of kids your age have tried marijuana. Have you ever tried it? Do you have any friends that have tried it? And to make it just sort of non-confrontational, open, allow time and space for silence and discussion, and let the kids sort of come out with what they want to tell you.
And then because I have such little kids, they haven't come up to me and talked about marijuana yet. God forbid that ever happens. But if they do, I mean, when do you actually? Do you start that conversation first, or do you wait for them to come to you?
I think it's great to start it first.
Really?
So kids will often have a lot of questions about lots of different things that are kind of controversial or embarrassing. So their bodies or sex or drugs, and they're not often going to come to you first. So if you start having those conversations before they get kind of freaked out about those things, it'll be much easier for them to say, actually, I do have a question about that.
Okay. Well, Dr. Elizabeth Mead, Swedish Medical Center, thanks for joining us once again. Back to you.